I started high-altitude mountaineering, I was able to draw on the experience of other high-altitude climbers. I'd often heard of altitude sickness, pulmonary and cerebral edemas, and fatalities.
In all, I have lost 29 friends. Men and women I used to climb the highest mountains with. And that's really sad. We all try to overcome the fear somehow, to negate it.
That's a major problem with these high-performance people. They can't admit that they're not feeling well. They see that as a sign of weakness. If you have an altitude edema and you don't descend at once, you could be dead within 24 hours.
The likelihood of getting acute mountain sickness is around 50%. So 1 in every 2 mountaineers, in other words, half our test persons, will develop it.
One day, 2 students came to my office and asked if I would supervise a dissertation they had planned. When I asked them about the subject, they said it would be a thesis on altitude sickness, on the effect of altitude on the human body. That's actually a brilliant idea, I thought later. I could spend some time in the highest hut in the Alps, in the Capanna Regina, on the summit of the Monte Rosa, and it would also count as work.
Einige Zeit verbringen und das gilt als Arbeit. Dann ist der Peter Bertsch dazugekommen.
Peter Bertsch agreed to participate as well, and somehow we complemented each other. And that's how our studies into the effects of high altitude on the human body began.
We don't really know what causes mountain sickness. The condition can best be compared with a hangover or a migraine attack, especially if it also involves nausea and vomiting. That's the best comparison. The symptoms are relatively easy to describe: extreme tiredness, slight dizziness, headache, and a loss of appetite. As a rule, these symptoms occur between 4 and 8 hours after climbing to an altitude of over 2,500 or 3,000 meters. The higher up you go, the more violent they become.
Research into mountain sickness covers a wide range of areas. To a certain extent, they involve clinically applicable issues like: how can climbing be made safer? How can accidents be prevented? But in part, it also involves purely fundamental scientific issues which touch on the fields of molecular biology and molecular genetics. And to some extent, findings from research into altitude sickness can also be used to treat patients in general.
In 1972, together with Reinhold Messner and other friends, I went on my first expedition to the Himalayas, to the south wall of Manaslu, the world's 8th highest mountain. We climbed the wall and found ourselves at an altitude of 6,000 meters or so. Then we were hit by a snowstorm. I climbed to 7,000 meters. Too much and too quickly. I have always been short of breath at altitude, but suddenly I noticed that my breathlessness had got worse. I was coughing more and more, and frothy sputum was coming from my lungs. I got out my stethoscope and listened to my lungs. What I heard were puffing and rattling sounds. I diagnosed that I was suffering from a pulmonary edema resulting from the altitude. And I knew that at the time, my only chance of survival was to descend as far and quickly as possible.
High-altitude pulmonary edema is characterized by liquid collecting in the alveoles, the air sacs in the lungs. The blood vessels become porous and blood plasma leaks out. So oxygen uptake is considerably impaired, and in the end, to put it very plainly, the sufferer actually drowns in their own blood plasma.
In 2005, I went to Everest for the first time. There were 3 of us in the team, myself, Ralph Dojmowicz, who was my partner at the time, and our Japanese friend Hitotaka Takeuchi. I thought I would go on ahead. And at an altitude of about 7,700 meters, I created a platform for our tent. At some point I turned round and saw Hirotaka. He seemed somehow to be moving rather strangely, not in his usual way. I descended a bit and asked him what was wrong. "Give me your backpack," I said. "No," he replied, and then simply collapsed in front of me. He was suffering from a massive cerebral edema. I had a pre-filled syringe with me, 100 milligrams of fortecortin, and gave him an intravenous injection. I also handed him some chewable Nifedipine capsules. Then, all I could do was hope and pray somehow he would react. Hiro said later that he had watched us. He could see quite clearly that we really were fighting for his life. By morning he had recovered a little, but he could no longer walk on his own, of course, so we hooked onto him left and right and got him down. Although he still had problems with his gait, he could walk. The further we descended, the more stable he became. All in all, everything went well, but it was touch and go.
In Summe genommen ist alles gut ausgegangen, aber das war schon sehr, sehr knapp.
High-altitude cerebral edema impairs all the mental functions. The brain swells, but it is trapped inside the skull, so it can't expand. This puts pressure on the important centers, basically on the respiratory and circulatory systems. Ultimately, if the sufferer cannot descend immediately and improve his or her oxygen supply, these important centers can become compressed and no longer function. Death can then occur within 24 hours.
We reserved part of the hut for installing our study equipment and the bedrooms for our test subjects. In our first 1 or 2 days up in the Margherita hut, we planned to organize all the rooms so that we could carry out all the tests we had planned as smoothly as possible.
Nahtlos und komplikationsfrei durchführen können.
The study taking place this summer is headed by Mark Berger. He qualified as a professor with us. He's an anaesthetist, but he also cooperated on a research level with our department in Heidelberg and has worked in the field of high-altitude pulmonary edema. He will carry out further altitude medical studies in the Margherita hut. He wants to know if mountain sickness can be prevented by taking corticosteroid tablets as prophylaxis. Can the condition be prevented by inhaling them?
Kann man die, wenn man sie inhaliert, verhindern?
The second question is whether the primary organ where acute mountain sickness originates is actually not the brain but the lungs. Do they play a far greater role than we have previously assumed?
CS 26 ms 25 CS 24 MP 3 SL räume ich weg.
Wieder in die Gruppenkiste rein.
The setting we have here in the Margherita hut differs, of course, from the one we have when we're dealing with patients and test persons at the university hospital. Here, everything is more cramped, more difficult, and of course, our possibilities are limited. We have found that for some reason, equipment which is normally reliable starts to develop problems at altitude. See if you can dig out a phone number.
Hello, Mahdi Cerebral here. We are in the hut at an altitude of 4,500 meters, and I've got a problem with the echo equipment.
Mahdi, the internet's working, so maybe I can fix it.
At first, here in the Capanna Regina Margherita, we simply examined the people who came up here for symptoms of mountain sickness. And they were all glad to be tested simply because they felt pretty rotten.
The first clinical study on serious mountain sickness took place in the Margherita hut in 1985. It was treated with dexamethasone, a corticosteroid which is administered, for instance, for acute high-altitude cerebral edema. We were the first to try it out in a field study. We showed through tests with mountaineers that it substantially reduced the symptoms of serious altitude sickness.
I first tried it out for the first time on myself when I was suffering from mountain sickness, and it really worked. Consequently, we developed the emergency treatment for acute mountain sickness. It is designed to help people to survive and descend. But on no account should they try to climb higher.
Herr Steindl, I can hear you, but you're very faint. Fine, Herr Steindl. Now I can hear you a lot better.
He won't be able to reach anyone now, so even if they manage to get hold of a machine, they won't be able to transport it to Alagna until tomorrow at the earliest, and then it has to be brought up here.
I'm really depending on you. We've got to have some kind of a solution by 1 p.m. tomorrow, otherwise this central element of our studies will be lost.
On Makalu in 1986, we climbed to an altitude of 7,000 meters in 4 or 5 days. We then put up our tent. I had a lie down, and in next to no time, I had developed acute high-altitude pulmonary edema. It was so serious that in actual fact my chances of survival were nil.
Also so, dass eigentlich das Überleben nicht mehr möglich war.
I thought about what I might do if something like that happened. So I took some Nifedipine, which is a cardiac drug. All the time there was foam coming from my lungs. But within 10 or 15 minutes, I already felt better. Afterwards, together with my research colleagues, I tested the treatment I had tried out on myself, this Nifedipine, on patients in the Capanna Margherita.
At the time he contracted his high-altitude pulmonary edema, I went to the clinic in Visp, where patients with high-altitude pulmonary edema from the Monte Rosa massif were hospitalized in Switzerland. I had a look at their addresses. Together with Dr. Nanzer, the senior consultant in Visp, I recruited people, and for the first time, relatively quickly took 8 persons who were susceptible to high-altitude pulmonary edema up to the Margherita hut. This meant, of course, that we now had a model for studying whether Nifedipine could be helpful in treating or preventing the condition.
And it was successful. We wrote the first paper on this method of treating high-altitude pulmonary edema. Nifedipine for high-altitude pulmonary edema was published in The Lancet, and it became a classic. Since then, it has probably saved the lives of 1 or 2 people who have got into great difficulties at altitude.
We faced some obvious challenges. On one occasion, a blood gas analysis machine malfunctioned. Then we still had a problem with the echo equipment, but in the end we managed to fix it. I hope that's all. So at the moment I'm actually very happy. Around half our test persons will develop acute mountain sickness. And through the way we have designed the ascent, around 6% will also suffer from a high-altitude pulmonary edema. So, statistically, 3 of the 51 people in our study will develop a high-altitude pulmonary edema. That's not a problem for us because at the Margherita hut we are used to dealing with test persons up there who have developed either mountain sickness or a high-altitude pulmonary edema. It goes without saying that we have an adequate supply of all medication necessary for treating acute mountain sickness and high-altitude pulmonary edema. Otherwise, the study would not be ethically justifiable.
Ja, ich hatte heute Nacht ein bisschen Kopfschmerzen. Okay. Das ist dann zum Glück heute Morgen weggegangen. Servus.
First of all, let me welcome you all up here at an altitude of 4,554 meters. You'll be sleeping on the second floor at an altitude then of 4,559 meters. That is what it said in the test person's information you were given. We hope you had a pleasant journey and that the ascent to get up here wasn't too strenuous.
In 1983, I had a few weeks' holiday and flew back to Nepal, where I met my friends to climb the glacier dome. A relatively easy 7,000. That shouldn't be a problem, I thought. We made it to our base camp as quickly as possible. After 1 or 2 days, we began our ascent through ice falls and over some cliffs. On the last day of the ascent, I struggled along behind my friends. Finally, we reached the summit around 4 in the afternoon. My torment was over. I had made it. My friends had already started back down. I had this terrible headache, but I'd handled the climb, or so I reckoned. As I began my descent, suddenly there was this huge man from northern Germany on my left. "Why are you following the trail down?" he asked. "Go straight down the wall, it's a lot faster." I had never seen the man before. It was just my sick brain hallucinating. But I thought his suggestion was an excellent idea. Then it got dark. I continued descending with my crampons. At some point I slipped and fell a short distance. I then had to bivouac without any equipment. So I lay down on this icy ledge. I couldn't see a thing. I was virtually blind. That too was the result of mountain sickness. Then I had my Aunt Frida next to me, saying how wonderful the stream was, and that you could catch trout in it. I was so glad to see that my friends had come back up to rescue me.
Dass meine Freunde von unten hergekommen sind, mich zu retten.
They were standing next to me, but they weren't really paying much attention to me. Instead, they started building this cableway, which they then traveled up and down on. Because they were sort of ignoring me, I turned over and went to sleep. Somehow, I survived the night. The next morning, the tall stranger had gone. I realized that my only chance of surviving lay in a direct descent. So that's what I went for. I knew that I stood a huge risk of triggering an avalanche, but it was my only chance. I really did set off an avalanche which carried me several hundred meters. I was hurled to and fro and hit the ground quite a few times. In fact, it was just pure luck that I wasn't killed. But apparently, my number wasn't up yet, and I survived it all. I staggered on down until in the end I met my friends again. Surviving that entire trauma not only cost me a vast number of brain cells, I also lost my toes. They had to be amputated. But somehow I survived. And I'm really grateful that I did.
Irgendwie überlebt und ich bin dankbar dafür.
Wir haben dann mit den ersten Messungen angefangen.
We then began taking our first measurements. They were the same measurements we had already taken in our preliminary studies in the lowlands. We carried out pulmonary function tests, heart checks with ultrasound, and physical tests to measure blood pressure, heart rate, and oxygen saturation in the blood. We took blood samples for laboratory analysis, and we evaluated mountain sickness scores, the degree of seriousness of mountain sickness.
Okay. Tief einatmen und pusten, 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 weiter pusten, weiter, 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 nicht aufhören, weiter pusten, weiter pusten, weiter, 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 weiter. Bisschen geht noch, noch ein bisschen, ja.
You're fine now, right? But there's no problem. The graphs are identical, even though the air appears a bit thinner.
Schon ein bisschen dünner, die Luft.
The first reports of acute mountain sickness date back to the time of Alexander the Great, when there was mention of headache mountains. As we know, the Alps were conquered in the late 19th century. That's when a physiologist called Angelo Mosso became active in Turin. He had plans to set up a hut on the Signal Cooper. Mosso was sponsored not only by the Alpine Club of Italy, but above all by Queen Margherita of Savoy. She even insisted on attending its inauguration in 1893. In all, 3 rooms served as research laboratories, and this hut became the center of research into altitude medicine.
My generation, of course, now knows a lot more about mountain sickness and altitude medicine. Pioneers like Oswald Owels experimented a lot on themselves. And we, as the next generation, have benefited substantially from this. For instance, I always have Nifedipine in my first aid kit for treating high-altitude pulmonary edema. And for that, we have to thank Oswald Owels, who proved its effectiveness.
How do you feel?
I am fine.
Ja, aber ich kann es jetzt gerade nicht reinstecken. Er hat schon Eiklösung drinnen und dann muss die wieder rausspülen.
PeO2 is dropping. It's now at 42.
42,5. Jetzt gucken wir, ob er jetzt kalibrieren muss oder nicht. Durch zum Fenster immer.
Do you still feel fuzzy?
82 zu 82, also 82 Frequenz, 82 Sättigung. Und jetzt auf mich zukommen. Okay, warte.
That's better. You now look a bit different.
Catwalk.
Ja. Ja.
Ja, ein bisschen die Messen da.
As a rule, a day's rest is sufficient for treating the symptoms of slight mountain sickness.
Wenn sich die Symptome verstärken und wirklich schwere Kopf-
But if the symptoms intensify, with really serious headaches, nausea and vomiting, and do not abate after a day's rest, then we have to step up the therapy to prevent the situation developing into a high-altitude pulmonary or cerebral edema.
Hirnödem zu verhindern.
Ja. Ja.
The Margherita
cocktail is a combination of 3 drugs which attack mountain sickness in 3 different ways. The first drug is dexamethasone, a cortisol derivative for treating cerebral edema. It somehow seals off the blood vessels. We've never understood just how it works, but neither has the medical world in general. The second drug is Nifedipine, a cardiac drug which expands the pulmonary vessels. This lowers the pressure in the circulatory system in the lungs, and with it the formation of edema.
Und deswegen wird die Ödembildung, also der Wasseraustritt von
So it reduces or prevents blood plasma seeping into the alveolus in the lungs. The third drug is Diamox, which improves respiration. It stimulates the respiratory centers directly through acidification, and this combination of 3 drugs is designed to combat serious mountain sickness, somewhat so that the sufferer is able to descend and thus survive. The descent is the main, the causal therapy for high-altitude pulmonary or cerebral edema.
If there is no chance of giving someone oxygen or of descending because the weather is too bad, or if I cannot provide oxygen during an expedition, the test person or the mountaineer can be treated by means of a portable, hyperbaric bag.
Den Probanden therapieren oder den Bergsteiger therapieren. Das ist ein Sack, in den legt man den.
The climber is placed inside the bag, which is then sealed to make it airtight. The air pressure inside the bag can then be increased with a hand or foot-operated air pump.
Den Luftdruck in diesem Sack erhöhen. Und zwar kann man mit einem solchen Überdruck.
A hyperbaric bag can simulate a descent of around 1,000 meters in altitude through an appropriate increase in the air pressure and oxygen partial pressure.
Des Luftdrucks und des Sauerstoffpartialdruckes erwirken.
I again came into contact with acute mountain sickness on Nanga Parbat. Zach really suffered from it in base camp. He had a massive pulmonary edema. The mistake back then was that he was alone in the tent and never said that he was feeling very ill. In the morning, he never showed up for breakfast. So I went to his tent to look for him. He already had really cyanotic lips and was producing a lot of sputum. It definitely was a massive pulmonary edema. He could hardly stand. I then descended to a lower altitude with him. I sat next to him all night and looked after him. If we hadn't checked up on him in the morning, he would undoubtedly have died. I have noticed for years that men have trouble admitting that they really feel unwell. And when they are ill, they find it very hard to tell a woman in particular that something is wrong. It's an experience I have often had, and I believe that it also played a role back then.
Okay, Magdalena, also jetzt hattest du
Magdalena, your oxygen saturation level was at just over 50%, which is very low. You had a headache, you were nauseous, and you had to vomit, right? But the medication should now make you feel better, and the oxygen should get you fit enough to be able to make the descent.
We know for certain that above an altitude of 2,000 to 2,500 meters, mountain sickness can be avoided by climbing slowly, no more than 300 to 500 meters a day, or by going into the mountains more often. So early acclimatization and a slow ascent are all factors which basically guard against mountain sickness.
We talked about it on every expedition, but ultimately, of course, our final goal had to be Mount Everest. And Wolfi Nayetz was given permission for an attempt in spring 1978. Back then, only one approval was issued. As a result, in March 1978, we were the first Austrian Everest expedition. A good part of our expedition was conventional. We planned to use oxygen for the ascent. But Reinhold Messner and Peter Habeler said that they would try to climb Everest without oxygen. Reinhold had this incredible ability to think of things you actually couldn't even imagine.
Reinhold hat eine unglaubliche Fähigkeit, Dinge auszudenken, die man sich eigentlich gar nicht mehr vorstellen kann.
My personal view was that that probably wouldn't be possible. But as I focused on the issue more and more, I came round to thinking that it might work after all.
Und mir gedacht, dass es möglich ist.
In 1924, on the north face of Everest, the British, or maybe it was just one Briton, reached an altitude of 8,560 meters without oxygen. It was there that this picture was taken of him on his own. But then he turned back. He reached the age of 90 and it seems had not suffered any serious damage from his experience. That actually showed me that with the right tactics and the right climbing speed, you could still even cover the last 300 meters or so to the summit. The entire world, including every specialist, said it wasn't possible. Firstly, without extra oxygen, you wouldn't even be able to move above 8,500 meters. And secondly, your brain would suffer so much that even if you did make it back down, you would have serious complications. Quite simply, your brain would be addled. But I was now convinced that with the right tactics, it could be done. With the very best climbers who were properly acclimatized and could get up and come back down as fast as possible. I told Reinhold and Peter this, and they managed it. Naturally, when I met them on the Lhotse flank, on May the 9th, they were a bit tired, but they hadn't suffered any brain damage, and they continued their descent without requiring any help at all. Whereas Reinhard Karl and I still had to achieve our grand goal. On Mount Everest, I had the chance to attempt the summit in the first group with Wolfi Naetz. I was well acclimatized and was totally set on climbing the mountain, by any means. But then I said to myself, well, now there's a little trick you could try. I had read in a German surgical magazine that the increase in the number of red blood cells, which occurs at altitude, is actually not so good because it makes the blood thicker. So I decided I would thin my blood. I took a whole liter of blood out of a vein in my left arm. To compensate for it, I infused a saline solution into my right arm. And it worked wonderfully well. I reduced my hematocrit value, the proportion of red blood cells in my blood, from 58 to 52%. But I became seriously ill, and I had wrecked my dreams of scaling Everest. While my friends were reaching the summit, I lay in my tent with the onset of a cerebral and pulmonary edema. I was furious with myself. Through your stupid idea, I told myself, you have ruined your chances of making the summit.
Vermasselt, wie man sagt.
Tell me, Catlin, what's the bigger problem now? The nausea or the headaches?
It's just the headaches.
We've already given you paracetamol and something for the nausea, but the headaches are still quite strong, right?
Yes.
And the nausea reading between 0 and 5 is what?
It's 3.
But before it was 5, wasn't it? So the drug has improved the situation. Could you perhaps now get hold of Mahdi for me?
Peter holen, ja. Oder erstmal den Mahdi vielleicht. Mahdi? Ja. Also sie hat jetzt
Mahdi, she now has serious acute mountain sickness and needs oxygen. So I'd like you to quickly do the PA pressure. Then we'll do the lung function with Peter. After that, she can have oxygen. But let's get a real move on. Okay.
Hast du gemacht, oder?
Ja, habe ich schon gemacht, die sind immer Werte da.
Also die Kapillare läuft schon, oder?
Die Kapillare ist schon fertig, ja. Ich habe sie jetzt aber noch dann hängen lassen.
Ja. Wie geht's dir?
Du kriegst jetzt von uns den Sauerstoff.
We're now going to give you the oxygen you need.
Einmal Kopf anheben, Kopf mal hoch. Okay, Kopf wieder runter. So.
It will help you very quickly. I'll tell you straight away about the values we obtain.
Von den Werten haben, ja.
Your oxygen saturation is relatively low. That's where your headaches and nausea come from. But there is only a slight increase in the blood pressure in your pulmonary vessels. So you don't have acute high-altitude edema. You've just got serious mountain sickness.
So.
The heart rate is good.
Nevertheless, within a week, I had recovered well, and I was lucky that Reinhard Karl was a guest member of the expedition. We had included him because to boost our expedition budget, we wanted to sell the pictures he was taking to a magazine. Naturally, he had to wait until all the Austrians had made it to the top, or at least tried. In the end, there were only the two of us left. Reinhard Karl and I looked at each other and said, what they can do, so can we. So we two lonely warriors climbed Everest together. We were overjoyed when we reached the summit, but we did it with oxygen. I would never have made the summit without oxygen, and I know that it is cheating to do so, because that's not the real Everest you've climbed. The real Everest was climbed by Reinhold Messner and Peter Habeler on May the 8th, 1978. Then the mountain was 8,840 meters high. Anyone using oxygen downgrades Everest to a 7,000. All the same, I'm glad I reached the summit. At an altitude of 8,500 meters, I took off my oxygen mask for a while and tried to continue without oxygen. But it was impossible. I got a few steps, but no further. Then I just floundered about. I realized that I just had to put the mask back on. After that, I was fine again.
Now I can remove the mask.
Okay, super.
This can go too. Now your nightmare is over.
Thanks for everything. Now I can get some sleep. Thank you. But I couldn't sleep. Suddenly, I couldn't move my head. Then I just felt rotten, so sick I nearly threw up. I was just a total wreck. That's when they took me out and examined me and gave me oxygen. Then everything was fine again. I must say that the symptoms were intense. I can stand a lot of pain, but the headaches, I can't describe how bad they were.
After Peter Habeler and Reinhold Messner climbed Everest without oxygen for the first time, scientists everywhere asked themselves how they had managed it. The hypothesis was then put forward that the two had a special ability to take in and utilize oxygen. Because I knew them both, I was able to carry out a study. I tested 8 high-altitude mountaineers who had climbed above 8,500 meters without oxygen. And I must say that it was the most boring study I have ever done. Everything was completely normal. The ability to climb Everest without oxygen doesn't depend on maximum oxygen uptake capacity. It is determined solely by what climbers have between their ears. It depends on motivation and, of course, having the right tactics and so on. But in every aspect, we were able to measure these super high-altitude mountaineers were all extremely normal.
But 2 other factors need to be considered. Firstly, you must have good economy of movement so you can progress optimally with a minimal amount of oxygen. You have to know the right holds and the right steps to take. You don't slip, you don't wobble, because all that consumes energy. So your technique has to be excellent. And Messner, for instance, is a superb mountaineer, someone who has trained so much on difficult walls, someone who can climb with great subtlety and with low oxygen consumption. That, I think, is the first thing. The second is experience, instinct, intelligence, call it what you will. It means turning back at the right moment. Messner turned back more often than he went on to the summit. This combination of great experience, being able to assess the situation, to move economically, and being extremely fit and motivated, that gets you to the top.
Many people tell me I've been lucky because I've never suffered from mountain sickness. But I must say that every time I felt something was wrong, I have turned back. If I feel pressure in my head at high altitude, I know it's because I've not had enough to drink or I climbed too fast. But then I react. And if the headache still persists after I have drunk quite a lot, it tells me that I need to descend a bit. And that is what I do.
Some of the studies we carried out up there have already resulted in us now knowing how a serious high-altitude pulmonary or cerebral edema can be survived.
The human body is so complex, it poses so many questions, and we still have to find so many pieces of the mosaic. But I do not believe that the ultimate piece of the mosaic actually exists. The piece which will finally enable me to say, now I know. That piece just doesn't exist. The overall picture will continue to grow. We will plumb the depths more and more and come up with newer and newer questions. But the day will never come when we can say, now we have answered all the questions with regard to high-altitude medicine. That just won't happen.
That is always the case in medicine. When one problem has been solved, lots of other questions emerge. The work never ends.
Science has shown us the limits at which man can survive. That was the exciting aspect. And that with a certain degree of pharmacotherapy. Drugs, in other words. Everything can be improved.
In these studies, just like in extreme mountaineering, you have to endure some tough times. There are frustrating moments where you think, I'd rather turn around, drop everything and go and hide. But when you are finally successful as a mountaineer, and also when you complete a medical study into the effects of altitude, then you know what satisfaction means.
Abschluss einer höhenmedizinischen Studie sicher gegeben.